Good afternoon, all, and welcome to our roundtable discussion on the Common Agricultural Policy, organized by the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, ELIAMEP, here in Athens. Well, as you may know, the Common Agricultural Policy is currently at the crossroads of a changing world environment. This environment has been impacting both the demand, food inflation, and the supply, energy, and input costs of agriculture, and also agri-food trade geostrategic tensions that have taken a turn to the worst in recent days, I should say. And this is a context of our roundtable. Our guests today are Tassos Chaniotis, who used to be a high-ranking official at the European Commission in Brussels, and he's now a senior guest research scholar at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Anastasia Kanavou, who's a senior policy advisor, and she has experience in working with the European Parliament, but also with national policymakers. Charalambos Kassimis, who is a professor emeritus at the Agricultural University of Athens, and Alan Matthews, also a professor emeritus at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. I am Manos Matsaganis. I'm a professor at the Polytechnic University of Milan and a head of the Greek and European Economy program at ELIAMEP. I should add here that our first speaker, Tassos Chaniotis, has written a policy brief on the Common Agricultural Policy, which we at ELIAMEP published a couple of months ago, and which I hope that you will all read. It's freely available from the ELIAMEP website. Now I will put my first question to members of our panel, which is rather general and sweeping, I should say. It's a silly question, but even silly questions help to get the discussion going. So my silly question is, why do we have a common agricultural policy? What is the argument in favor of such a policy at EU level? And why should the EU have a common policy in agriculture versus all other policy areas? And I will ask Tassos Chaniotis to start here.
Thanks, Panos, and hi, everybody. Yes, it's a question that keeps coming and going. In fact, I myself asked provocatively, if you want, this question when I became a director of the European Commission 15 years ago or so. And it has a double answer. If one were to ask the question today, would we set up a common agricultural policy in the current environment? Clearly, the answer would be no, because agriculture today is a sector that corresponds to roughly 1 to 2% of the GDP. But the common agricultural policy didn't start today. It started with the beginning of the then European Economic Communities, and it is essentially the only common policy that can be seen in different ways, because the 1 to 2% of the GDP actually manages 50% of land in the European Union and produces 100% of food. And what is also very much interesting, it's the common agricultural policy is linked to what is happening with trade, where the EU is the largest exporter of agricultural products around the world, and also a very huge importer. It's very much linked with environmental challenges. It's very much linked with growth in rural areas. So it covers a pretty wide range. What is also important to keep in mind is that the CAP is a significant part of a very small budget. It's 1/3 of the common budget of the European Union, but the budget of the European Union is 1% of GDP, 2% of public expenditure. So if we ask the question today, it's not going to be, why do we need a common agricultural policy. For me, the pertinent question is what we do with the one we have right now. And clearly, there is an argument for those that say, let's do away with the common agricultural policy because we have other type of priorities. But we need to be very clear with the answer. 27 national agricultural policies coming from where we come would be policies that would be more expensive from a budgetary point of view and more trade distorting within the European Union. And the second question is, and what we do about it. And I think what we have to do about it is improve what we have been doing for the last 30 years, that is keep reforming the common agricultural policy and adapting it to what are exactly the priorities of today. And clearly the priorities of today is to address simultaneously, in my view, global climate change and food security problems.
Thank you, Tassos. Would any other of our speakers
May
like
I?
to? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation and for having the opportunity to discuss with those esteemed colleagues. Well, what could I say about the CAP? In my mind, it has been always like an old lady that we must respect. As Tasso said, it's not just a farm policy. It's a comprehensive framework that addresses food security, rural development, and sustainability. I don't want to say again what Tassos just already pointed out. I would just like to share with you that when I'm trying to think in the case of Greece, what would happen without a common agricultural policy in Greece, I really cannot imagine. And I'm not just referring to the budget. I mean, I'm also talking about the strategic priorities. In my view, the CAP primarily serves as a funding mechanism, maybe, that supports national agricultural and food strategies, of course, aligning with specific EU objectives. Having worked for many years for the Greek Ministry of Rural Development and Food, I have noticed that a robust national strategy is lacking. And this is particularly evident in the measures under Pillar 2. Each time we try to implement various initiatives, we end up spreading our budget too thin across many small interventions instead of developing a clear strategy that could maximize the impact of the limited CAP budget available to us in Greece. So, I cannot imagine what would that mean for the Greek reality. Thank you.
Okay, we'll have a question. I hope to have time towards the end to speak specifically about the implications and prospects for Greece. So I wonder whether Mr. Kasimis or Professor Kasimis, Professor Matthews would like to add anything on the fundamental questions of why we should have a CAP in the first place, and whether we would come up with a CAP if we were to design EU policies from scratch.
Let me hop in, Manas, if you like. I think it is important that we have a common agricultural policy because that, in a sense, guarantees a single market in agricultural and food products. And that is the fundamental goal, if you like. The common agricultural policy is a means to that end. So it means that farmers compete on a level playing field. And it also means that consumers benefit from the fact that they have access to farm products from across the European Union. So if we go back, as Tassos correctly did, to the origins, you had at the time of the six founding members of the European Economic Community, you had six different national agricultural policies with very different price levels and support systems. So in order to create that integrated market, we needed to create a common agricultural policy. Of course, we can now debate as to whether what has emerged from that, which I would describe as a sort of common agricultural support policy, actually fits the needs of today. And I think we will come to discuss that. One element that I would want to highlight, because it comes up perhaps later in our discussion on budgetary issues, is that a consequence of the financing of a common agricultural support policy is that there are net gainers and net losers from the policy. In other words, more member states contribute into the pot as a result of the common financing of the policy, and other countries are, in a sense, net payers into that pot. So that distributional element plays a hugely important role when we come to look at discussions around the budgetary implications of the agricultural policy.
Very good. Thank you. Professor Kassimis?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Just one thing I want to add. I have to remind us that the Common Agricultural Policy still serves a number of European public goods. And I think Tassos mentioned that, but it is important to remember that. The second thing is that I cannot imagine what will happen to the European farmers without common agricultural policy. And I think this is something that we have to bear in mind when we discuss the prospects of the common agricultural policy. And in this direction, I think it would be very interesting to see how the discussion will develop when we discuss the new proposals and recommendations for the common agricultural policy.
All right, let's assume that you have persuaded me that it's a good thing that we have a common agricultural policy. May I ask you my next question, which is, all right, but is the current common agricultural policy fit for purpose? Is it appropriate to the current environment? Or does it need to be reformed? If so, in which direction? I will start with Dr. Kanavou this time.
Yeah, of course it needs to get reformed because all the policies need to get reformed. And the common agricultural policy has to keep the pace with what happens in our everyday life. And it's also, I mean, citizens ask for the CAP to be reformed. First of all, farmers. We remember the great protests last year. They have many, let's say, abstentions. There is so much debate on the European Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy, and the farmers find it very difficult to keep these objectives high. I mean, they have financial problems. So yeah, the common agricultural policy needs to be reformed, and we do it almost every 7 years. And it's not only what the farmers have to say, it's also what the consumers have to say. We need sustainable food, we need less pesticides, we need a better environment. And also the budget of the CAP is limited, and everything has to be covered in there. So yeah, we need a reform, and we need it very quickly to happen.
Okay. Professor Kassimis?
I think the farmers' mobilizations and the problems we faced last year confirmed in the best way that the common agricultural policy needs a reform. And even the running common agricultural policy needs a reform because it proved to have deficiencies which needed to be corrected. And I think the European Commission, under the pressure of farmer mobilizations last year and the problems that came up with the Green Deal and the parts of the Green Deal incorporated in common agricultural policy, I think we realized that the reform, in a sense, should come earlier. That's why we experienced a relaxation policies connected to the implementation of the Green Deal on the part of agriculture. And the new discussions, the new communications, if you like, open the ground for this reform process, which means that we should always be alert and flexible to make the appropriate adjustments and changes, reforms that the policy needs. because as we have experienced over the past 3 years, the pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, and the geostrategic changes that that brought, and the problems in the food chain and all that, somehow made necessary an intervention by the Commission in order to correct, if you like, certain things and review the possibilities of a new reform in the common agricultural policy. And what we see, and I guess we're going to discuss it later on, this relaxation of the implementation of common agricultural policy has more or less said goodbye to the Green Deal and the farm to fork strategy and biodiversity strategy on the part of the common agricultural policy. And I think we have to, and I close, be flexible and quick in adjusting to the changes that the policy is facing.
Mm-hmm. I'll ask you to elaborate on the death of the, or you said goodbye, all right, of the Green Deal and farm to fork. But before that, I would like to hear what Professor Matthews and Dr. Haniotis have to say on whether the current common agricultural policy is fit for purpose.
Well, in my case, I would want to recall that we have, of course, had a succession of reforms of the common agricultural policy. And in particular, the current version of the policy introduced what we call the new delivery model, which involved two important elements. One was that it introduced a more performance-based approach, but secondly, it gave much greater flexibility to member states to design their agricultural policies within a common framework. So the first point I would want to make is that it's now less significant what we do at the European level. Member states have enormous potential to design an agricultural policy which they think is appropriate. If they want, for example, to allocate funding to smaller farmers, to cap funding for larger ones, they can do that to a large extent. If they want to allocate more funding for environmental purposes, they can do that under the current policy. If they want to allocate more funding to risk management to help farmers with climate adaptation, they can do that. So I would want to emphasize that a lot of the action, if you like, in terms of designing of agricultural policy is now at the member state level. But that's not to say, of course, that we shouldn't try to fine-tune the regulations also at the European level. And here, I guess 3/4 of the CAP budget still goes to direct payments. We know that they are still distributed in a way that really doesn't target farmers either who deserve to get it or who need to get it. And that's an important distinction. So yes, we do need to see further reform, particularly on the direct payment side. Yeah, so let me stop at that point.
Thank you. Mr. Haniotis?
Yes. I mean, in a sense, any public policy is never fit for purpose because the world is always changing so rapidly. The process of decision-making is relatively slow, so you always need to catch up. But I think it's very important to ask ourselves, fit for purpose, for which purpose? And I see three areas that in the broader scheme of things, in the big picture, require a clear look into what we need to do with the common agricultural policy. The first one sounds a little bit technical, but I think everybody also understands it's in real life. I mean, my generation of ag economists grew up with the notion that the long-term trend of agricultural prices in real terms is downward. And this is something that lasted for 150 years. Well, guess what? In this century, in real terms, first of all, agricultural prices stabilized and then they started picking up. The long-term downward trend has been reversed. Second, when we look at the input costs, they have gone up by more, whether it's fertilizer or energy. And when we look at the food costs with the recent food inflation, we've seen that they have gone up way much more than what producer prices have gone up. So what we have is a situation where the terms of trade of agriculture have deteriorated. Primary agriculture is squeezed. If you add to that the challenges of climate change and the challenges of increasing food deficits in certain parts of the world and the global food security issue, you see a mix of problems that require sustainable productivity growth. In other words, they require that we bring together the economic and the environmental aspects of agriculture. And this exactly the adjustment agricultural policy needs to make with all the flexibility that is necessary because soil conditions are different in different member states, structure of agriculture are different, but with a very clear common sense of priorities that should all deliver for the same objective, that we need to produce more with less environmental impact. And in that way, we could, if you want, correct one of the weaknesses of the common agricultural policy, which has had very impressive results in terms of the economic and sometimes the social dimension of the policy. But when it comes to the environmental dimension of the policy, it came wanting in many areas.
All right. So what is your assessment of recent developments on the part of at EU level in the direction of the common agricultural policy? More specifically, we have had 3 communications published by the European Commission recently on the competitiveness compass, the future budget, and the vision of EU agriculture. Can you tell me what is the shape of things to come? Do these 3 communications and other developments at EU policy level tell us anything about how the common agricultural policy is going to evolve in the near future? Do you think that this all goes in the right direction? I think I will start with Professor Kasimis, and I will ask him to take the floor and tell us what he thinks on this.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. First, I think that the 3 communications communicate, I must say, and I found that very, very interesting. I think there are cross-cutting areas, and what we would need to do is wait and see how this will translate, if you like, into legislative frameworks that will allow us to have an even better assessment of the value of these 3 communications. But I'm going to start with what I see as a common ground, if you like, in these communications. First, I see that there is a common ground between the key priority areas of the vision for agriculture and food and the competitiveness compass in the areas of innovation, in the areas of decarbonization and competitiveness, and in the area of the reducing of dependencies. And if we look at the enablers that the competitiveness compass mentions, which are the simplification, the financing, and the coordination policies that I'm really interested, we see that these are very important for the new proposal recommendations for the vision for agriculture and food. This is one thing. So there is a common ground between these 2 communications, and there is also a common ground between these communications and the multi-annual financial framework, in which we see a very specific reference to the food security and nature protection and guidelines, direction, if you like, which is not distance from the directions of the vision for agriculture and food, which is connected to an approach which seeks targeted support for farmers who need it most, something that we have already mentioned here. Proposals for positive environmental and social outcomes connected to the support of farmers, rewards for and incentives, if you like, for treating the ecosystem services, and support for enabling the conditions, better conditions living and working in rural areas. So in the multi-annual financial framework, we see directions towards a reform of the common agricultural policy, which will be simpler, more targeted, more environmentally careful, if you like, connected, and at the same time providing the support for those who really need it most and offer most in the objectives of the common agricultural policy. So my final appreciation, if you like, assessment of the proposal that interests most, which is the proposal concerning food and agriculture, the vision for food and agriculture. My assessment says that it is in the right direction, because this is one of the questions. I think it corrects the deficiencies of the running common agricultural policy. And but at the same time, it maintains the key elements of the two strategies of the Green Deal incorporated so far, maintains the key elements without, however, maintaining the coherence of the strategies, of these two strategies. So personally, I'm not happy with the fact that we are facing, if you like, out the Green Deal. I'm still uncertain about the budget size, which is very important for the implementation of policies. I'm still uncertain because there is nothing about it, especially in the vision for agriculture and food, concerning the funding structure, whether we're going to move towards a single fund. And I'm also uncertain and I feel unsafe with regards to what concerns issues like the external convergence, the issue of direct payments, because I personally still believe that direct payments is still a safety net for the farming population, although I agree with Ireland that we should set a number of conditions for getting the direct payments. So my overall assessment is that the policy is in the right direction, but we still have to see how this will unfold in terms of policies and legislative framework in the time ahead. As we all know, the devil is in the details, and we still have to wait and see how these developments, how we will see these developments unfolding in the next few months.
Thank you. Professor Matthews?
Well, that hard to follow that thoughtful contribution. For me, the vision paper, I will concentrate on that. It's really full of individual proposals. It's kind of hard to see the prioritization involved. And if I were to try to pick out one theme, it's clear the farm to fork strategy is not mentioned per se. But I get the impression from, if you like, some of the complementary statements that we have been hearing from the Commission that the policy is, in a sense, to move away from what I might call the polluter pays principle. In other words, that to the extent that there are adverse environmental consequences of farming practices, the loss of biodiversity, water pollution, soil degradation, ammonia emissions, and so on. These are still seen as issues to be addressed, but in future they will be addressed by rewarding farmers, by paying farmers to do the right thing, rather than through regulating their behavior. And that raises two important questions. The first is, of course, where is the money going to come from? Because if we are going to pay farmers to do the right thing, that requires additional funding over and above. We can, of course, divert some of the existing CAP funding, and that would be an important first step, because it's clear that not all of that funding is well used. But it would also require additional funding to achieve the ambition that we need in some of these environmental areas. And the question is, where will that come from? And then the second issue is, of course, that it relies essentially on voluntary uptake. It requires member states presenting a set of instruments to farmers that they are willing to engage in. And we know from the existing evidence on the uptake of voluntary measures, for example, the agri-environment climate measures in the pillar 2 of the CAP, the rural development pillar, that yes, you do get selective uptake, but rarely do you get anything close to 100%. So the coverage of these voluntary measures would also be of concern to me. Will we really get the ambition that we need? So maybe I just stop at that point.
I'm tempted to comment that according to the cause theorem, whether you have polluters pay for the pollution they cause, or whether you pay polluters in order to pollute less, from the point of view of efficiency, there is no difference. The only difference is distributional: who pays whom and who benefits, who bears the cost. So.
Yeah, yes. I mean, that is absolutely correct. But as I say, if you are relying on a voluntary uptake, your coverage is not necessarily going to be the same as if you had a mandatory system in place.
That's a very good point.
To me, it would make sense. And if I may actually just follow up on one of the issues, which I think will be an important element in the coming political cycle, and that is the role of agriculture in the 2040 climate target. The Commission has made clear it's going to propose a reduction of 90% by 2040 compared to 1990 levels. Agricultural emissions have been falling indeed, but not fast enough. So we need to accelerate that. And how we would do that. So, for example, a discussion of including agriculture in some kind of emissions trading scheme. It's the only sector that's not covered by a trading scheme within the European Union at the present time. So it would be an obvious step to take. But of course, that brings you into this coast dilemma that you are going to levy a price, if you like, on these emissions. But you could combine that by also, in a sense, subsidizing the practices that farmers need to adopt in order to actually get those emissions reduced. So I would see a combination of the regulatory element. It's important, but you can also address the distributional questions through subsidy. But of course, that raises the question where the money will come from.
Yes, of course. Dr. Haniotis?
Yeah, thanks. I will start with the points raised by Alan, and also what Aralbo said before, because yes, the devil is in the detail, and the reason that we kept talking about what Alan was mentioning right now is because we have no clue about these details. So in summary, and also focusing on the vision paper, which is much more related to the future of the common agricultural policy. It's not only the details that are missing, but when you have spent 33 years of your life in a career in the European Commission, you read in between the lines sometimes. And I mean, for me, there are good, bad, and some ugly aspects in the vision. The good news is, for a change, agriculture comes again with the role it should have. It is a vital sector, and that's the first phrase of this communication. And after going through a period of self-flagellation and catastrophology, where we tended to treat one of the most sophisticated, if not the most sophisticated and innovative food system in the world as something that is broke, where we saw in the response in the COVID that was the only sector that didn't reduce its economic activity. It's good that we start focusing on what the sector could do with all the weaknesses that it has. So that's the good news. The bad news is, as already has been mentioned, there are no priorities. It's a little bit of everything. So if you want, it is a vision for many tastes, but there is, for me, one blind spot. The word competitiveness, it's mentioned 30 times, the word productivity, not once. One could say productivity is in between, but why not clearly so? I will try to explain afterwards, in my view. And then there are a couple of ugly points that we need to clarify. This not one allowed to sell below the minimum cost of production means absolutely nothing from a policy perspective. Which cost of production? Are we talking about marginal cost, average cost, of whom at the sectoral level we are about to introduce from the back door policies of linked to prices that failed very badly in the past. And there are issues related also to trade where you ask yourself, I mean, what have we done wrong? And when we still keep open the possibility that what is imported in the European Union should meet the same standards, but it meets the same standards. Otherwise, it should not circulate in the single market. So there are some things that need clearly to be clarified. Then, in the form of an example, and especially with a link with the farm to fork strategy, the problem with the farm to fork strategy was not the strategy itself, which was the proposal of the previous CAP reform. It was the setting up of targets that were all symmetric and round, 50% reduction, but were not based on analysis. So they raised the ambition too high to degrees that were not realistic, and that generated the reactions it generated among farmers. So you have to be able to demonstrate what is the range of objectives that you set and how you're going to achieve them. And it has to be a combination of regulation and subsidization, but taking into account something that Manos in your theoretical concept, neutrality about the manner by which you do the polluter pays, doesn't see one characteristic of the agricultural sector. Primary agriculture is a textbook definition of a competitive sector. Producers are price takers. But if you go upstream and downstream, whether it's the input sector or the food processing and retail, you have oligopolistic structures. So price transmission is extremely inefficient and non-transparent. What does it mean in practice? And I will finish with this example. One of the most promising areas that I see in the vision paper is the area of carbon farming. I'm not sure that we are ready to go for an ETS, as Alan mentioned, but I'm sure that carbon farming is a reality that people and farmers are looking into. And you have many private schemes at the same time. So rightly so, the vision paper recognizes that there are too many schemes out there. But what does it propose? Instead of proposing some harmonization of a minimum number of indicators, it proposes an additional voluntary scheme on the part of the Commission. So we're still going to be lost in terms of identifying the most serious aspect. What is carbon that we're going to price, tax, impose a tariff? Soil characteristics are so different that both the carbon sequestration but also the emissions are very different. So what are we going to price? And are we going to set the same price for practices that have such a different impact? We haven't even started this discussion, and yet we're about to decide on what type of taxation we're going to put on what tariff at the borders. And in my view, we risk once more in putting the cart in front of the horses.
Thank you. Dr. Canavu?
Well, yes, with so many interventions, I mean, I get more confused than I have already been reading the three communications. I would say that they signal a paradigm shift towards strategic autonomy, sustainability, generational renewal in EU agriculture. And it seems that together they aim to future-proof the sector against climate shocks, global competition, rural depopulation. We have a great problem with demographics in Europe, and we should not forget also this part of the CAP. It's not only, direct payments. I fully agree that the devil is in the detail, as most of you have said. And yeah, the vision may be in the right direction because it's like a menu for every taste, as it has been already mentioned again. But this is not the proposal for the common agricultural policy. We have many steps to take, and we don't really know what is behind all these, on all these, let's say, key priorities that exist in the communications: competitiveness, sustainability, fair standard of living, resilience, food security, rural development, enabling environment to do everything, and simplification and stuff like that. It's huge. Where the money is going to come from? We see also that we talk about something like merging maybe cohesion funds with rural development funds in order to support the rural areas. And what kind of merging is this will be? It will take funds from the CAP towards the cohesion otherwise, or maybe we keep our funding for the CAP and the cohesion policy will cover the rural development part. I don't know. These are all very important and no details that we need to clarify. What else? About the European Green Deal, it's not like the European Green Deal is phasing out. The strategy is there. The farm to fork is not phasing; it's disappeared for sure. And Tassos explained very well why, with all these reductions of pesticide use and stuff like that. Things that were not very well, let's say, studied, and we didn't know the impact, and we saw what was the result, with the protests and everything. And I would also like to say that we need to find a balance between being competitive and being fair at the same time. We need to make sure that small farms can access technology and markets while also hitting the sustainability goals. The funding and the goals, they're inclusive, are encouraging, but we need to be very careful on how we implement them. It's crucial, to address past inequalities so that no farmers, no consumers, no regions are left behind. And we need a great collaboration among all the levels of governance. So we expect to see what is coming after this vision.
Thank you. Well, several of you have already mentioned the farm to fork strategy, and you have said that some of you have said that it's dead and buried, or perhaps it's no longer as prominent as it was. So I would like to ask you if you can explain very briefly what the farm to fork strategy entailed and whether it's still alive, moribund, dead, whatever. And I will start by asking Professor Kasimis to tell us what he thinks.
Well, what I said is that in the vision for agriculture and food and in the other communications, we didn't see any reference to the farming, the strategy for farm to fork and biodiversity, which means that we consider that the policy intends to leave out these two strategies. So what did it entail? I think Tassos said it. There were very overambitious goals with regards to these strategies, with reference to the reduction of pesticide use, fertilizers, the expansion of organic farming, and more specifically, it was provided for a reduction of 50% by 2030 of pesticides nearly 20% reduction of the use of fertilizers, an expansion to 25% of the cultivated area for organic farming, and what was the other thing? These were the key areas of intervention. We all knew that these were targets that could not be met in the course of this running policy. And in the implementation of the policy, we faced various problems with this strategy. One of the key problems was not only that there were over-ambitious targets. The problem was that the industry could not replace the synthetic, for example, fertilizers with alternative products. They were not ready. The provision for an increase of organic farming to 25% of the cultivated land was nearly impossible without any attempt to consider the consumption side of the issue. So this kind of policy was very early realized that it was difficult to be implemented and reach this target. So this was the main sort of elements of this farm to fork strategy, plus of course other areas which probably we don't have to discuss right now. But these were the main over-ambitious targets.
So in a way, yes.
Yeah, maybe just to make a comment on what Professor Kazimis has just commented on with respect to biodiversity in particular. I'm a little bit more optimistic on this front. There is a clear mandate to the Executive Vice President in charge of the Green Deal, Teresa Ribeiro Rodriguez, if I pronounce her name correctly, where she is mandated to incentivize nature positive actions and to ensure that we invest in our biodiversity. And I would see this as in line with the comment I just made previously. We did see eventually the passage of the Nature Restoration Law. It does set targets for member states. There are no mandatory requirements of farmers or land managers. So again, it's up to member states to incentivize farmers to take the actions that are necessary to restore the quality of habitats and to restore biodiversity. So again, it's this voluntary approach which is being emphasized, and that's also in line with the idea of incentivizing nature positive actions and the idea that perhaps we can get the private sector involved in sort of funding what are called sort of nature credits along the same lines as kind of carbon credits that Tassos was referring to in a moment. So I'm kind of going to be interested to see what that actually how that will materialize. Will there be legislation? Will there be funding to ensure that? But it is for me at least important that the commitment is there in the mandates. And indeed, I would have to say that the Commission President herself, von der Leyen, has spoken and written very eloquently on the need to address the biodiversity crisis. So that also gives me some cause for optimism on that front.
Okay.
May I come in here? Based on my experience, I mean, first of all, what's the difference between the farm to fork and the proposal made in 2018 for the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy? It's 4 quantitative targets. 25% organic farming, starting for around 10%, by the way, all by 2030. And 50% reductions on nutrient balance in the soil. The 20% reduction in fertilizers was just an estimate of what it could mean. The obligation, the target, if you want, was a reduction in nutrient balance in the soil, 50% reduction both on the most toxic and overall the pesticides, and 50% reduction of antibiotics in animals. Antibiotics in animals was already done. 50% reduction in the pesticides. We are going to get the first data from member states by 2028. Natasha was very much involved at the parliament at the time with Petros Kokalis as the rapporteur in trying to actually convince member states not to give the data by 2032, but by 28. And yet we had a target for 2030. And for 25% on organic, I don't know anybody that believes not only in the target, but a sector that is actually demand-driven and value-added driven needed to have a target on area. So the problem is not only a European one. The problem is the sustainability development goals of UN. The problem is what is usually called aspirational targets that fail to inspire. I still remember vividly one of the best soil scientists that I know that has been part of these committees, international committees on climate change, saying in a conference, if we get 50% of what we ask for, we're very happy. Well, you might be happy, but in the public domain, this is considered as a major policy failure. So as long as we set targets that are like balloons that are being inflated with round numbers that are not based on solid analysis, then we're going to pay this price. Because it is one thing to try to force a policy to bring you at the frontier of what you could do, which is what the Commission did after the Paris Agreement, which in my view is one of the greatest successes of all commissions of all times, an extremely difficult agreement to arrive at, with two impact assessments, including the one that we did at the time for the Common Agricultural Policy, that were based on ambitions that were at the frontier of all the technologies we knew, but still way below the 55%. And it's a completely different thing to run into a competition of who will come up with the biggest number. And this is the price that we paid. And now, in my view, and I agree with the others, we're going to the other extreme. We spent 5 years overemphasizing environmental priorities, and now it's as if we don't have an issue with climate change and environmental priorities, and we discovered that the economy is very important, but both are extremely important. Climate change is not going to go away simply because some of the words we used to use in the past have disappeared. It's there and it's much more pertinent. So we have to see how exactly we are going to address that. And in my view, the best way to address that is start refocusing again on what should be the starting point of every policy decision making, which is, I mean, what's your problem definition? What is the priority you have to address? And what type of analysis do you have to actually support you in that? And this is one of the areas where Europe actually has global leadership. There is nobody else that has the Earth observation capacity that Europe has. On the ground, on research projects, we see practices and results that are working. And we haven't even managed to communicate to actors about this possibility. And that's where, in my view, we need, if you want to go back to the drawing table, but we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. We just need to make it moving.
Okay. May I ask Dr. Kanavou if she would like to say
I would just like to emphasize on what Tassos explained. I mean, in the parliament, I led the technical negotiation about the SIO file. This is the statistic about input and output in agriculture. It was considered as a technical file at the beginning, but in the end, as we were keep discussing and negotiating, it was obvious that it had some very important political angles, like the use of pesticides. So we finally managed to have data and ask data from the member states for the use of pesticides annually. This was very difficult to find a compromise and for everyone to agree. And And even in that case, now the regulation says that there is the provision that the farmers should give data. And in the end, we're going to have statistics, first time in 2020 to 2028, and with data from 2026, and then we're going to have annual data. There was a prerequisite on that in order to be able to do that, we needed the farmers to keep statistics through digital tools, okay, electronically. This was not obvious at that time. It needed some months for an implementing act to have this provision. And now this did happen. Farmers are obliged to keep data on pesticides used through electronic means. But now member states at the council, at least 15 of them, react and say they cannot do it. I mean, I understand that we cannot have like huge targets that look like a balloon. And if you go back to the parliament, a proposal gets in the parliament and the political groups, they're like 40% reduction, or I want 50% reduction, or I want 35% reduction, with no data behind that, with no evidence behind these targets. And it all comes like we get results through politics without a strong scientific base behind that. And, you know, this gets to be a problem, I mean, even at the level of the co-decision procedure. Yeah, as far as the European Green Deal, it's there. And if you see the communications reaffirm its objectives. I didn't mention previously the biodiversity strategy, as I just said about the farm to fork strategy, because biodiversity is there more or less, with carbon farming and nature credits, new things, very interesting. But in any case, you know, we need to reflect to the lessons that we learned from recent farmer protests. There are systemic issues like the income disparities, the unfair burden on farmers, the global competition, and yeah, I think the future will reveal whether the EU remains dedicated to the Green Deal or not. Thank you.
All right, but you know, there is something that I wonder about. We have witnessed huge mobilization of farmers in some countries, for instance, the Netherlands, but other countries too, which also led to political gains of political parties, mostly electoral gains, mostly at the right side of the political spectrum, that brought some of these forces to even coalition government. So my question is, were the farmers in these countries and perhaps elsewhere right to oppose the Green Deal, the farm to fork, whatever irked them? Or was it simply a rather narrow attempt to divert responsibility and costs to the rest of society? Is there anything that you can say about that, having been experts in the common agricultural policy for a number of years? How do you see with sympathy the farmer mobilizations around Europe in recent years? I know that this is a tricky question, so I will start with Professor Matthews, and I will ask him to say something on this if he likes.
There are many dimensions to the farmer protests. Very immediately, we had a situation with the most recent CAP reform, where we increased the demands on farmers. So there was enhanced environmental ambition in that CAP reform, but the funding, particularly in real terms, given that there was significant inflation during the last political cycle, was decreasing. So that was an immediate spark, I suppose. The actual issues which sparked protests were, in fact, quite specific to individual countries. The reasons why Polish farmers were protesting were not necessarily the same as why French farmers or Italian farmers were protesting. However, they did converge around a number of issues: the environmental burden, the perception that imports did not have to meet the same standards, and of course, a perception that income was threatened. I feel that underneath these, if you like, more immediate causes of the protests, we should be aware that there are sort of tectonic plates which are shifting. Farming has become much riskier as an activity, not only in terms of markets, with the volatility we see both in input prices and in output prices. We also see weather conditions increasingly unstable, and farmers having to deal with droughts, but then subsequently, heavy rainfalls and flooding and so on. So it seems to me there's a huge mental strain on farmers arising from this additional volatility and instability. And that may have driven, if you like, some of the angst, if you like, behind the protests. There is a sort of a paradox that on the one hand, there is a sort of general recognition that we should try to move more towards a results-based approach in agricultural policy. In other words, we should pay farmers for outcomes rather than for inputs or for practices that they may adopt. But that implies measurement, that implies monitoring, that implies verification. And we see that in the carbon farming discussions that Tassos highlighted a moment ago, where the transactions costs of actually engaging in carbon farming are going to be very high. We want to see high quality credits, that's quite understandable, but the actual cost of ensuring high quality credits is a lot more data collection, a lot more verification by farmers themselves. So that's a paradox, and I'm not sure that we've yet got a good answer. The sort of standard answer is, well, we can do it all digitally. We'll have satellites in the sky which will do a lot of the measurement and monitoring for us. And of course, that's important, but it seems to me possibly only a partial solution. So, a lot of issues behind the farmer protests. I'm suggesting to look at some of the deeper ones, as well as if you like, the immediate demands that the farmers themselves have been raising. And I'm just highlighting this, if you like, paradox or dilemma between moving more towards a results-based approach and yet at the same time wanting to simplify the impact of these regulations on farmers themselves.
Thank you. Dr. Hanyotis, do you have any views on whether the farmers are right to mobilize?
Yeah, well, having gone through 6 reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy, I have views, so please control me on the time if I overdo it. Now, first of all, farm demonstrations is not something new. We have had it in previous reforms. We've had it with the Macsari reform, we've had it with fishery reform, we had it with WTO negotiations. I think we need to keep in mind one thing that's very important. First, you have to explain in advance why you need to do something. And second, you have to be able afterwards to defend what you have done. And we have seen in the past reforms that were made of the Common Agricultural Policy were the same farm organizations that were complaining and demonstrating against them were the first ones that were defending the reforms afterwards, because they saw, for example, that farm income improved after the reforms of the 90s and 2000s. We have seen the same thing with many of the trade agreements. We have this debate right now in Mercosur, right? In all the trade agreements we have had, in the beginning, it was going to be a disaster. And then what they see the results, for Greece is typical example, with the Canada agreement and the increase in agricultural exports from Greece to Canada, they become something else. This time, it was different. And that's where we need to look at. And why was it different? Because so many things were happening at the same time at global level that farmers started having question marks about the long-term horizon of where they were going. And we came with a narrative at the EU level that considered the agricultural sector as a problematic sector. Well, that's the sector that, among all the global agricultures, it's the only one that has reduced emissions. Everybody else is increasing emissions. Yes, we have to do more, but let's first recognize that we've done something. It is a food system that everywhere I traveled in the world, they would tell you, I mean, I went to New Zealand to some of the most advanced dairy factories that would tell you, and this is European technology, and this is European technology. Everybody's using the Galileo system to improve their statistics and look at weather. And we have gone into a process of self-flagellation. And that's, in my view, what made farmers react in such a way. Because out of the blue, they didn't see where they would fit in a process that they know that they have to make adaptations, but where they were going. Because it's easy to throw away all sort of chemicals, but in the question, and what do we replace it with, we didn't have an answer. Typical example, the schizophrenia we have with agricultural biotechnology in Europe. When we look at human health, when we look at animal health, biotechnology is fine. When we look at plant health, all of a sudden, Nobel-winning techniques, we have a debate on whether we apply them in Europe. The second thing that is also extremely important is what was mentioned by Alan. And that's where, in my view, we made a mistake. I mean, I used to have the title simplification for some years in my directorate that was dropped out because there is a very perverse idea that simplification is the number of articles that you have in a legislation. It's not. And when you look at the monitoring of the policy, you can have indicators that are at the global level on the basis of data that exists and look at the overall performance of the sector. But when you go at the farm level, you better be careful about what you ask the farmers to provide. And this is where I came over with Alan on a couple of workshops with the idea and the proposal I made now that for me, we have to prioritize soil, not because it's the only thing that matters, but around soil, you have more information. You have every farmer that has to be responsible about what they're doing, and you can use a limited number of indicators that tell you how things evolve. And you know that if you do good things on soil, water, emissions, and biodiversity are going to gain. Instead of opening a long list of encyclopedia of indicators that all of us at the end of the day know that in most of them we don't even have the necessary data. So what made farmers to react the way they reacted this time, apart from the national characteristics, was the fact that they had the feeling that people started talking about agriculture without having a basic understanding of what the main challenges that agriculture was facing were. And that's where I think we paid, unfortunately, a pretty heavy price in terms of opening the ground for all sort of populists to just complain without actually proposing anything concrete.
Dr. Canavu?
I almost forgot the question. I think it's
the question was whether farmers were right to mobilize.
Yeah, of course. The farmers, as everybody, every citizen and every professional has the right to mobilize.
No, the question is not whether they had the right, whether they were right.
Yeah, whether they were right. That's what I know. I understand the question very well. It's not that simple. It's not a right and wrong. As explained by Alan and Tassos, it's a very complicated situation. And if you see, the protests were not for the same issue in each member state and not at the same time. In Greece, they delayed, as always. For me, it is important to try to keep the farmers informed at every stage of the political cycle. I mean, even now, we have started discussing about the new vision for agriculture. And I don't talk only about Greek farmers, because I have the opportunity to discuss with farmers from several member states, and they're out of the equation, out of the discussion all the time. When we keep them out of the discussion, it is easy for I don't know, for organizations or political groups or that share specific interests to spread fake news to the farmers and to get them confused and to use them to take the tractors and come in the front of the European Parliament and get fires and protests and things like that. I mean, the farmers want a solution to their problems. Their income is getting down all the time. There are income disparities, like farm incomes remain 40% below non-agricultural sectors. The burden is unfair, like farmers bear 80% of VGT compliance costs, while retailers and processors profit from green branding without sharing costs. I mean, there are huge problems here. And when we cannot talk just about farmer or just about agriculture. We have, again, to see the whole value chain, from farm to fork, from farm to waste. I mean, it's everything, it's interconnected. And again, there is this global competition, and EU farmers face cheaper imports produced under weaker environmental rules, and we need to find a solution on that. The weather extremes, it's not easy. For me, it is important to try at each level of the policy cycle to keep them close to the policymakers, local, national, European, I don't know, to all the levels, let's say, to keep them informed and try to change the narrative and talk simple to the farmers and explain. And first of all, hear to what they have to tell us, hear to their real problems. We have been discussing about carbon farming and nature credits, even the eco schemes. What happened with the eco schemes? The eco schemes was a way to be able to give the direct payments, okay? And at the same time, the farmers would care, let's say, for the environment and would take some sustainable farming activities on board. But you know what happened in reality? The farmers, not only in Greece, but also in many member states, they believed that part of the direct payments was already, they had it already. It was, it's not something that they have to comply with the regulation or with a scheme or with the farming right to get it. They feel it as it is their own because they had it already. And we had a regulation and we said, now in order for you to take this part of your direct payment, you have to do these things. And the farmers never understood why this happened. They felt that this was unfair. And at least in Greece, when the eco schemes were announced, nobody understood what to do. Nobody. And not only in Greece, in Lithuania, in Belgium. So yeah, it's nice talking among us, but we do not work for us. We work for the farmers, for the consumers, for the rural areas. Yeah, it's complex. Thank you.
Professor Kassimis?
Well, I have to be very brief. I hold the view that the farmers did not oppose exclusively to the common agricultural policy and the Green Deal. It applies entirely what Alan said, Tassos and Natasha. Other factors were involved, differentiated between one and the other country in Europe. But in my opinion, one of the key problems was that the farmers were asked to do more with less in an environment of multiple crises without any consultation, any communication of the new policies, which created conditions of uncertainty and and safety. And that was the response to this sort of situation. We experienced that in Greece. We tend to ignore the fact that, for example, climate change and the skyrocketing cost of production have put a lot of pressure on the productivity and the income of farmers. But what annoys me most is the fact that through all these conditions, the farmer gets the impression that the common agricultural policy is to blame for what happens, which is not true. It's not entirely true. So we have to see how policies are implemented and how farmers are informed about these policies. And then I think we can somehow try to work with them in order to adjust to the new conditions in present day, the present day conditions in environment, in policy, and the economy.
If I were a neoliberal economist, which I'm not, I would say, this all that you say proves to me that government handouts create dependency. So here we have an occupational group which is unable to think of themselves as, business people who produce something and try to sell it to the market because they expect the EU to come to its aid no matter what. What would you say to this imaginary neoliberal economist?
No, it's not imaginary, first of all. But first of all, the weak spot of the neoliberal economists is they assume markets work perfectly. There are massive market failures in many areas. We saw it clearly in the banking sector with the big crisis some years ago. But especially in agriculture, the biggest problem we face is price transmission. There is no clear explanation why in the world food inflation exploded the last 3 years in such a way, despite what happened in commodity markets, because commodity markets went up and then went down again. There is no explanation to that, unless one does a solid job of looking at competition authorities and what they had to find out. So there is an issue of not having the conditions that are necessary for a fully functioning market economy being in place. Second, in terms of the path dependency, that we hear this argument in that terms a lot about the common agricultural policy. Where is the path dependency in the common agricultural policy? Because if you look at sort of the span of decades, we went from a system of very high tariffs, export subsidies, and high intervention prices to couple support. Then we went to decouple support. Then we went to increase conditionality of the policy. That's not a perfect policy because in every step there were weak spots. But these are areas where the adjustment of the policy was trying to capture what society was demanding, actually. In a sense, and that's a big difference between the EU and the US policies. US policies continue to be supply-driven. EU policies are, in the broader sense, demand-driven. They're not driven by what the farmers ask. The problem with what the farmers actually expect is a different one, in my view. It has to do with something that already Alan was mentioned, which is it's Brussels that is responsible for everything. The implementation of the policy is at the member states. In fact, the decision-making is by the member states and by the European Parliament. And what you have is a typical case where you have a body that has a legislative initiative and makes proposals. You have a policy outcome that differs very much from the initial proposal. And then you have an implementation at the member state level that sometimes is all over the place. And this is the issue that we have to address. With co-decision, everyone of the three institutions has to learn some lessons. In my view, the lesson that the Commission should have learned and still hasn't learned is that it's not enough to make a proposal. You have to have a communication strategy that explains throughout the process, up until the final decision making, why you propose what you propose. The European Parliament has to have a body that's equivalent to what the Americans have, a congressional research service, some independent analytical capacity to be able to tell the members of the European Parliament, if you make 10,000 amendments, at the end of the day, the policy will be extremely complex. And the member states, they have to ask themselves, do they gain from adding too many national characteristics in a common policy, or at the end of the day, they end up undermining the very C in the common agricultural policy? It's a pretty complex question, but I think the problem with the neoliberal economy would be very simply, and what's the alternative? And all the analysis and scenarios we have done indicates that in the absence of the common agricultural policy, what you're going to have is a much more competitive European agriculture that will have greater environmental costs and abandonment in all the peripheral areas, rural areas. So that's what comes as a potential outcome. Gains at the expense.
Maybe I could chip in on just a couple of comments on Tassis's remarks. First of all, I think he's absolutely right to say that our decision-making process adds a lot of baubles, if you like, to a Commission proposal, which makes it very often more complicated as it goes through the system. I'm not entirely convinced by Tassis's argument that there's a real problem in price transmission. When I look at the food price monitoring tool, which Eurostat keeps track of prices, I don't see any real evidence of inefficiencies in the transmission chain. And indeed, when you look at the investigations that national competition authorities, who often, following the very high food price inflation we experienced over 2 years, some years ago, there was a lot of calls for investigation that there was, if you like, price gouging or profit taking by intermediaries in the food chain, and there was no evidence found of this in the European case. I'm not saying that this isn't the case in other parts of the world. So Tassis and I will disagree on that, but I think a fundamental dimension to your question, Manus, is that we talk here as if European agriculture is a homogeneous commodity. We talk about, looking after the interests of farmers. But there are huge structural differences between what we mean by a farm or a holding within the European Union. If I were to tell you that 3/4 of the food that is produced in the European Union is produced by just 300,000 farms. Now, there's 9 million holdings, and just 300,000, that's about 7%, produce 3/4 of our food. So, there's a huge difference between, semi-subsistence holdings, 2 hectares and so on, hugely important for rural development, for maintaining population in rural areas. But from the point of view of food production and so on, actually, I would say pretty irrelevant. Of course, they are sustaining their own livelihoods, but not contributing to marketed surpluses. So I think we need to keep this structural heterogeneity in mind when we talk about how we want to design an agricultural policy for the future.
Thank you. Would Professor Kassimis and Dr. Kanavu add anything to that? Well, okay, let me move. It's quite clear that I cannot get you to agree with me that there is something odd about farmers being supported so massively by the EU rather than other occupational categories, that they may have similar issues. Market failures may be not radically different, but it's all right. I don't want to press on. I'm already quite unpopular in my home country. I don't want to be even more unpopular as a result of that.
Sorry, Manus, but what you say is right. But there has been explanation, not only in the EU, but the whole world, that there is something specific about agriculture, because you have agricultural policies everywhere. And in my view, it has something to do with the uncertainty that all humans feel about how will their most basic human need be satisfied. It's about food. That doesn't mean that the policies are necessarily good. They might be totally inefficient, and they have been monstrous at times. But that's, for me, the underlying issue, that it is about food and about a very complex manner by which food is produced. And that's why you don't have a simple answer of what, market efficiency arguments alone would allow you not to have a policy.
Okay. Let's leave this at that for now, and let me move on to my next question, which is even more cheerful. As we have seen in recent days, perhaps weeks, we are inching towards a trade war between the European Union and the US that may or may not is likely actually to involve agricultural products as well, food, wine, whatever. Do you have any thoughts about the likelihood that this may happen, the severity of any EU-US trade war in the case of agricultural products? And do you see the likely implications of that for European farmers and the European agricultural economy more broadly? May I ask Tassos Chaniotis to start? It's an easy question.
Yeah, it's an easy, and in fact, it makes it easier that I'm joining you actually from Washington, where I'm here for the USDA Outlook conference that is about to start tomorrow on the next day. So that will give us, if you want, a sense when the new Secretary of Agriculture speaks about whether there are any thoughts like that. I've been dealing with the USCC agricultural trade relations before I even started my career in the Commission. That's a long time. I've never seen anything like this. I've always used the argument, and I believed in that the EU and the US are the largest partners and competitors at the same time. But partners and competitors meant that there was a common framework of rules that everybody agreed to, and you had differences of how these rules applied and whether in one or the other area one could do something more. And agriculture was always on the defensive in the European Union, except when we reformed with Fischler the domestic part, and the Americans faced the pressure in WTO. What we're facing right now is totally unique. I don't know what will happen about a trade war, because the discussion now is not about trade, it's about the vote in the UN, where the US voted with Iran, North Korea, and Russia. I mean, this is a dramatic event as such. And it's an event that marks a change in the manner in which this framework of common rules, almost overnight or in a very brief period of time, seems to have turned upside down. Now, when you look at the longer-term relationships in agriculture between the EU and the US, when I was based in Washington in the late 90s, up until 2000, at the EU delegation here, at that time, the US had a surplus in its trade with agricultural products with the EU. Gradually, they have a deficit. But you cannot focus only on their bilateral relations to see what changed, because the global rules were the same all this period, the WTO agreement. You have to look at the overall performance of EU agriculture and US agriculture. EU agriculture turned into a major net exporter on the basis of value-added products, the US remains a huge agricultural exporter where 40% is still bulk commodities, mainly maize and soya. And it's not only that they turned into deficit vis-a-vis the European Union, they have actually shrunk their overall surplus because the American consumers on both East and West Coast mainly started consuming exactly the same products, food products, that the EU is producing and that Canada is producing and that Mexico is producing. And it is only by looking into this situation that one can understand why you have all these significant complaints that the Americans keep raising about the deterioration of their agricultural trade surplus. But my feeling is that they're looking at their own cause. Now, what will happen between the EU and the US? We don't know because it doesn't depend on us. It depends on what will happen and how the president of the US, with what mood you might wake up one day or another. That's the situation we face, for good or for bad. What I think is that the EU is much more ready and prepared this time around than in the past to be able to address any potential issues and also be able to stress the need to retain certain principles. And when it comes to trade, for us is this extremely important because above anything else, the European Union is still a free trade area, a free trade union. And that's why trade is extremely important uh, to retain as a basic principle.
Okay, so let me get this right. You think we are all right, even if US EU trade war breaks out, the EU is better equipped to cope with it?
With a trade war, you're never all right, but we will respond. I mean, if you look at what happened in the Russian invasion in Crimea in 2014, overnight we lost 10% of our export market in agricultural commodities. We managed to recover and gain new markets. And I'm confident that the EU agro-food system has the capacity to respond to any challenges. That's the only thing I'm saying. But a trade war is the worst thing that one should do in the current climate of geostrategic tensions.
I'm delighted, Tasos, that you think we could come out of this, reasonably intact. I would be a little bit more pessimistic. First of all, I think we have to take Trump at his word. He's been pretty consistent. He's called himself tariff man. He sees tariffs as a way of financing the US deficit. So I think tariffs are going to come. And if you look at the products, the agricultural products that the European Union exports to the United States, there are the 6 at the top of the list. And 2 of these, namely spirits and what are called essential oils, which I think is the basis for perfumes and so on, I don't see these as having a huge impact on primary agriculture because much of the value embodied in these is their brands. But the other 4, and we're talking about wine, we're talking about olive oil, we're talking about dairy products, particularly cheeses, and we're talking about some cereal preparations and particularly pasta. So those are the 4 products that are at the top of the list and would be vulnerable, obviously, to tariffs of 25% as Trump has threatened. Now, of course, the EU may well make use of some of its anti-coercion trade measures, but of course, it's not necessarily going to benefit the sectors that will actually be hurt by the American tariffs. So if you look at, in particular, I guess with dairy and with pasta, you could envisage alternative markets. I think that's very feasible. I would agree with Tassos there. When you look at wine, about a quarter of our wine exports go to the US. And if you look at olive oil, about almost 40% of our olive oil exports go to the US. And it seems to be finding alternative markets or increasing domestic consumption for these products is not going to be really feasible. So I do see some difficulties down the line if indeed, not so much if indeed, but when Trump imposes these tariffs.
Mm. So what is the weight of the US market in EU exports of agricultural products, roughly speaking? Am I right in believing that exports to the US are more important for the EU than exports of US agricultural products are to the EU?
Much more important. We export far more to the US than the US exports to us. But actually, the biggest single export product that the US exports to us is, in the statistics, it's called tree nuts. And it's basically almonds. And that is by far the single biggest. It's ahead of soybeans, which is the next biggest export. But these pale into insignificance compared to what American consumers buy in terms of European food products.
So
Well,
if we get into a tit for tat retaliation trade war, we are going to suffer more than the US will, as far as agricultural products are concerned.
well, it
Am I-
depends how they're going to do it, because when we went to tit for tat in the past, the Americans were targeting specific countries.
Mm.
And if the US administration wants to target Italy right now, that's a big if, huh? Because I mean, this is exactly the logical element in trade wars. You think that you're going to get some sort of benefit, and when you do the calculation, you see that you've lost much more than what you gained. Wine, with all the fires in California, pasta, with all the significant decline in durum wheat production in the US and the alternative coming from Canada, I mean, it's getting pretty complex to implement. It's nice to throw threats, but when it comes to the nitty-gritty, then it's going to be something where, and I didn't mean, Alan, that we're not going to lose. But what I meant is that I feel confident that we have, first of all, a sector that has shown the capacity to adapt. And also on the other side, we have, a situation where the US tried to use trade as a means of bullying others, and that doesn't always work. And in my view, it's more tricky this time around than has been in the past. It's nice to open fronts against everybody, especially those that up until yesterday were considered to be your friends. But somebody has to make the calculation, and what do we get out of it? And that's not for me to make this calculation.
Okay, we are nearing the final part. We are into the final part of today's online roundtable. So I'd like to ask you, those of you who would like to give us an answer about the implications for Greek farming of everything that we have discussed today. So the common agricultural policy is in a bit of a flux, and an EU-US trade war is imminent. Is Greek farming ready for the blow or the impact of these changes? Can it adapt to the new reality that is likely to be characterized by both a different kind of a common agricultural policy and also a trade war with the US? Not all of you need to answer. Obviously, those of you who feel that they have something to say on the topic, please go ahead and take the floor. Who would like to start? Yes, please.
Start. Yeah. I don't know about Greece. I mean, I'm not sure we have adapted to the current CAP. I'm not sure if we are going to adapt to the next one. Okay, the policy framework is evolving, and as it happens always, it presents both transformative opportunities and critical challenges also for the Greek agriculture. Alan said previously that the member states, Greece as well, had the unique opportunity towards the current CAP, and we'll have it with the next one, to implement their own strategies, their national strategies, and they have tools to finance the strategies. So the game is in the member states' hand, let's say. Of course, there are the EU objectives. I would like to see if there was no CAP. What could be the Greek strategy about agriculture and food and rural areas? No CAP. We should have a strategy. I'm not sure that we do. And if we have a strategy, yes, we have one, which is written in our CAP strategic plan. I'm not sure that we have done the proper steps. And I mean, we have consulted with the stakeholders, with the farmers, with the rural citizens, with each and every citizen that needs to eat. There is I think also Babis mentioned that we lack the consultation part. I also said previously that we need to have farmers on board from the very beginning. We need to start discussing with them right now. Yes, if there are tariffs and stuff like that, Greece may have problems with olive oil and wines, probably. But I think that also as other member states, but I think we're going to survive. We survived COVID. We will survive this one. In Greece, we have a phrase, we say that money exists, and there are money everywhere. So when we need money, we know how to find it. But I think that in Greece, we have to, this time, to grab the opportunity and start now, do our study and see what has gone well, what has not gone that well, see what is the situation right now. And start building our national strategy for agriculture, food, and for rural areas as well. And this is very complex again, but and there are politics, of course, but we need to face this challenge and we need to take this opportunity.
But are you optimistic, or are we going to see tractors in Constitution Square in Athens?
Well, we see tractors every year. As Tasso said, yeah, the farmer protest is not something new. Okay, and the reason that they were so intense last year, it was not something that happened solely from farmers' will. So it's not bad to see tractors maybe on the roads.
Oh dear.
But okay, and it's a difficult task to do. And I say that knowing very well the situation, because I was head of the managing authority for the rural development program and head of the unit of programming and evaluation. I know how difficult it is. But we need to do it. I'm not sure that the agri-food sector is a priority for the Greek government right now, or the previous one. I don't care. I don't talk politics here. But I'm not sure that it is a priority. It doesn't seem to be a priority. We have all those rural areas, and all young people go to tourism when they have the opportunity to do it, go to the tourism sector. When they do not, they leave the rural areas and they go to the big cities like Athens and Thessaloniki, because those are the big cities. We have a huge demographic problem in Greece. So those are interlinked. And this is the moment to find a solution. This is what I'm saying. Not an easy task, but we need to do it. And it's not only the government. Farmers should be on board. Other stakeholders should be on board.
Okay.
Yeah.
Professor Kassinis?
Happy to follow the consultation and support those that are going to do the right job this time.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I think Greece is a very case of a country with regards to policy planning, policy implementation, and policy governance. And the latest victim of this situation is the recent common agricultural policy. We have a policy which hasn't been the result of consultation, a policy which hasn't been communicated with appropriate stakeholders, and policy implementation which has failed in a number of issues concerning, for example, the eco scheme measure, concerning the payments of agriculture, concerning a number of key structures for the implementation of the policy. There seems to be no plan for a national strategy connected to the common agricultural policy. And this is obvious and admitted by all stakeholders of the agri-food sector in Greece nowadays. I think the authorities, the government rather, and the corresponding authorities try to handle the daily problems of agriculture rather than discuss seriously the prospects for a national strategic plan, a possibility that gives us the common agricultural policy. I usually say that Greece has a national strategic plan, but doesn't have a strategy for agriculture and rural development. I made a post of this event today, and somebody made a comment telling me that there's no point in having this discussion because there won't gonna be agriculture in Greece in the next few years. I say that because more and more the farming population feels very insecure and are talking openly about a new rural exodus. Why? Because we are moving slowly but steadily towards what I tend to call a bipolar agriculture in Greece. A mass concentration of small and medium-sized farms with less access to financing, with low productivity, with no access to markets, easy access to markets. And at the same time, we see a concentration towards the top part of this scale of size of farm, technology, access to finance, and larger share of the market. And of course, this creates a condition of uncertainty. And there is no planning about it. There is no plan what to do next and how to handle this situation. The problem is political, in my opinion. And the political parties, when I say parties, I don't mean political parties, I mean stakeholders, are not discussing these prospects in what we call a public sphere. There is no public discussion about these problems. In my opinion, there are certain key areas of immediate needed intervention that if we don't do, we're gonna lose the last opportunity we have in this programming period. Because this is, in my opinion, the last time we have such a large budget for Greek agriculture. 19.3 billion euros is more or less the same as in the previous programming period. So I'm not very optimistic, but we need definitely to seriously discuss these issues if we want to get out of it as soon as possible. I have some ideas and proposals, but these are not for this panel in the sense that we don't have much time left.
Dr. Haniotis?
Yeah, let me state from the beginning my caveat, because I've lived all the accession of Greece in the European Union from abroad because I left for my graduate studies in 1980, except for 1 year that I did my military service. And by the way, it was a year in the mid-80s that the food that I was getting in my units was very good and was a lot. Now, on the other hand, I was surprised when I looked out of curiosity in all the missions, the trips I did while in my career in the commission in Greece, and there were more than 100, 115 to be exact. And I visited many places around Greece. So I'm not somebody that hasn't followed what is happening, although I wasn't directly involved with Greece in many occasions, except in the beginning. Now, three weak spots of Greek agriculture. The first one is the enormous budget dependency. 2.5 billion euros annually coming for the common agricultural policy is a lot of money. And whether this money is best spent, I think everybody knows when you compare it with the second big weakness, which is the administrative weakness, and some of the penalties that have been, is not well spent. One challenge is the fact that there are roughly 200,000 professional farmers in Greece and 600 to 700 beneficiaries from the common agricultural policy. There is a political cost in shifting the money to the real farmers, but it's a political, in the broader sense, a policy gain, longer term, if anybody dares to do it. But I agree with those that said that it's very low in the priority of governments. In all my years in the Commission, there is only one prime minister I remember that actively was involved in that during the fiscal reform. That was Simitis, that played a major role in not letting agricultural and the common agricultural policy actually pollute the big summit in Thessaloniki, and that helped the reform go through. The third big weakness.
Perhaps this is also because Simitis had been minister for agriculture.
Yeah, it is that, but it's also, I don't know, maybe it was also the personal relations he had with Fischler, speaking in German both and directly contacted. But that's from another, maybe it's from a book, this story. Now, the third weakness of Greek agriculture is the farm advice. A system, a farm advisory system, not a list of farm advisors, which exist, and some of it, by the way, are very good, some may not be so good, but a system that would give the same harmonized answer to farmers in terms of the issues that they face. Now, not everything is bad. In the midst of the economic crisis in Greece, the agricultural trade in Greece reversed previous negative turn and turned into a surplus. Something good must have happened in the sector to arrive at this. Second, you have a big driver that helps Greek agriculture, which is called the Greek cuisine, that now competes with the Italian on who is considered to be the best in the world. And this is based on ingredients that you have to produce in Greece and cover a wider spectrum, many times, of farmers that are not actually being supported by the common agricultural policy. And third, there is a lot of innovation on the ground. And this is not only a characteristic of Greek agriculture. I mean, for those of us that are Greeks of diaspora and see things from outside, well, one of the characteristics of Greece is that there is no such a thing as an average. You can have the best and the worst. The variation is enormous. So the best and the worst at the same time. And there are many, many good things happening. Now, I agree with Haralambos that there is a risk of a bipolar dimension in Greek agriculture, and that's where you need to have policy intervention to address it. I'm not sure about the exodus because that's the opposite of what we heard during the economic crisis, where supposedly everybody was going to go back to the rural areas, and nobody at the end of the day went to the rural areas. And what I think potentially could happen is that some of the real innovators and leaders in the sector, especially from the younger generation, would act as role models that others would have to follow. Because farmers will never do what bureaucrats are going to tell them, where academics are going to tell them, where politicians are going to tell them. Farmers will always do what other farmers have done before them, and it works. And such things exist in Greek agriculture. What doesn't exist is an effort to actually advertise them. And I think somebody should take this leadership, because it's worth actually putting an accent on some of the good things that exist in practice. I know that Alan will tell me I'm a little bit too optimistic, maybe here again, but maybe that's human nature. What can I do?
I was going to give the floor to Professor Matthews, both to comment on what we have heard, if he wishes, but also because I was wondering whether there is anything in the Irish experience of agricultural policy that might inspire all of us who wonder about what to do next in Greece.
Well, I was going to take the let out that you gave me earlier, Manus, by sort of saying not everybody had to contribute on this particular topic, because obviously this is not at all my expertise. But you've broadened the question a little bit, so I'm happy to take it. I mean, I do reiterate, Natasha also mentioned this point that there is now a lot of flexibility open to member states, even within the current framework of the CAP. And it seems to me that a lot of the discussion about the appropriate way forward can be taken at national capitals. And it seems to me that, of course, I can't speak for Greece, but certainly in my own country of Ireland, there is very extensive involvement of the farm organizations in agricultural policy making. We have a 10-year strategy, which is renewed every 5 years, which is effectively created by stakeholders and then taken over by the ministry as kind of their official strategy. So it's certainly not in every member state that farmers feel excluded. I would take up Tassis's last weakness that he mentioned, and simply say that we do seem to have evolved a fantastic, in the technical jargon, Manus, it's called an AKIS system, so Advisory, Knowledge and Information Service. So basically it's the link between your research centers, your advisory service, but also your educational elements, so your farm schools and farmer training centers and so on. We do seem to have developed, a very effective model. It is largely state supported, but there are indeed private agricultural consultants as well. So it's a sort of a hybrid system. That may be a model that could be, if that is indeed a weakness in the Greek system, that may be a model that could be looked at in greater depth. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, I think it's nearly 5 now, 5 in Central Europe, 6 in Greece. I think we can now bring our discussion to a close. We haven't quite solved all the issues that we have addressed, but I hope you will agree that we have had a very interesting and thoughtful roundtable discussion today. Well, I, for one, have learned a lot, and I'm sure those in the audience did too. So many thanks to our panel members, Dr. Haniotis, Dr. Kanavou, Professor Kassimis, Professor Matthews, and many thanks to you all for being with us today. Have a great evening.
Bye,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.